everybody. Can you hear us now?
I think we're live now. Can people on YouTube hear us? That's the question.
Yeah, exactly.
People on YouTube can hear.
Oh, awesome. So we're good to go over here?
Yes.
Awesome.
Okay. Working on my present now.
All
Close
right.
my email.
Oh, wait 1 second.
So close. So close. Almost there.
Yeah, they can hear.
All right, so we're now good to go. All right, very cool. All right, well, hello everybody, and welcome to our first in-person OWASP meeting in years. Yeah, big thanks to Okta, big thanks to Ryan and Brian, and big thanks to all of you for actually coming out in person. So yeah, give everybody a hand or a round of applause. Awesome. So yeah, we have a very exciting presentation for you guys today. But before we get there, just a couple of housekeeping rules. For one, is anybody hiring here? Anybody? Oh, okay.
We're hiring pen testers.
Hiring pen testers. Do you want to give a brief description of the job?
So we do mobile pen testing. And so we do pen testing for all the big mobile brands you would know. So you get to work on apps that you're used to using, among many other things. So from now, Secure, I'll be talking about mobile AppSec here a little bit. We are hiring for more pen testers.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Brian. And yeah, how about you?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I'm hiring a IT ops role on a security team. So doing a lot of info-related things, doing a lot of machine provisions, lots of jam stuff, all the good stuff everyone loves to do. So yeah, we're hiring for that. It's based in Montreal, preferably, but remote anywhere else if you can also swing that. But yeah, I would recommend it. Everyone, take a look. It's at Shake Day. Okay, guys? Good place, good place.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt. And if anybody is on the YouTube stream, if you're hiring or looking for work, please enter that in the comment section. I don't know where it is relative to me, but I'm sure you can find it. If you're looking for CPE credits or you have feedback for us, we have a link in the description of this video as well, so please use that to provide us with your feedback. And yeah, I guess before we begin, thank you again very much, Okta.
much more well known to break things.
Yeah.
Nine,
Mhm.
85, 40.
No, exactly. Yeah. So
Recording in progress.
Oh my gosh.
This will be weird.
Oh, did-
Let's hope nothing crashes.
That's where I'm going. So now I'm double sharing on 2 streams
okay.
and trying to show slides. See what happens.
First time for everything.
All right.
All right.
Does it work?
Does it work?
Luffy, does it work? Can you hear us?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So I think we are good to go. Thank you everybody again for coming out, and thanks again to Okta. Brian, are you ready?
Technology's fun. So, 6:43. All right, I've got 4 hours of mobile security training. We'll go to bar after. It's all good. So I had a chance to talk with a few of you, Mr. Crypto there, among others. So I'm Brian Reed, we see here. I'm standing right in the middle of everything. So, so thanks for having me at OWASP. It seems like this year, I think this is my first getting back together since COVID, meet up in the US, traveling around. So I'm an old mobile guy. I built and sold a company to some company you might know called BlackBerry. So I've been doing mobile and mobile security since the early part of the decades. Got involved with NowSecure. So NowSecure you probably never heard of, but NowSecure actually was the first mobile forensics company in 2008, 2009. So we started actually as a U.S. government SIBR was our VC, as it were, with a little bit of cash that got us started doing mobile forensics on early Android devices because the DoD quickly saw the opportunity to use these mobile devices for the warfighter kind of thing. But then we quickly morphed into a pen testing business and a commercial software business and all that other good stuff. So today we work with kind of the Global 2000 on mobile security. We do pen testing services. We actually are the OWASP. So we have on-staff people, and all they do is work on spec. As part of what we do, we have commercial software tools and a bunch of other things we'll tell you a little bit about. This really isn't an ad for us. This is more about trying to grow the population of mobile security skills in the world. And so I had a chance to speak with some of you like a year ago. It's good to be back. If you want to be a mobile pen tester, we do hire pen testers that are good pen testers without mobile skills, and we will teach you the mobile part. If you're good at pen testing, PCs, networks, applications, things like that. And we work with really cool companies, which is also great. We'll tell you a little about that. So from the OWASP perspective, the OWASP Mobile project was created when the web world figured out that mobile was different enough, we needed a different path. So part of my talk today is going to be, if you know your way around the ASVS and the web side of the house, and then use the mobile side of the house from this perspective. So in 2013, it was realized that we needed to fork the spec. 2015 was the first version of a spec, and that's where the OWASP Mobile Top 10 came in. Now, over the years, we've had a number of our security researchers be part of the spec team. Carlos Helguera, who is, I think, living in Germany these days, is the co-leader of the current OWASP Mobile project. A bunch of slides I'm going to present really his. We are an OWASP God Mode sponsor. What does that mean? That means we write a check to help make sure that the process runs. We're an MSTG advocate. So OWASP has created a new category recognizing organizations organizations that have groups of employees that are dedicated to the OWASP standards, which is what we do. So we're one of those. We also work, if you're in the SBOM space, on Cyclone DX, which actually was its own standard for SBOM definition and interoperability that merged with OWASP last year during COVID because OWASP was seeking a home and Cyclone DX was this tiny thing in the corner nobody ever heard of. Kind of brought the two groups together. Let's talk a little bit about that. Now, if you're in the web world, you may have noticed that there's no such thing as a web certification for OWASP. There's no certification. OWASP is a standards body, produces standards, training, all the rest. There's no certs. But two different certification groups have actually taken the OWASP specs and turned them into official certifications. So the first one is what's called the Google ABA program. So Google years ago created something called the App Defense Alliance, which is a group of vendors working with Google to protect the Android ecosystem. The App Defense Alliance took the OWASP MASVS spec that I'm about to give you an update on and said, let's create a compliance standard out of it. And so we're one of 5 ADA authorized labs. And so you notice like the Google logo on there earlier. That's because we test all of Google's apps for them, along with lots of other Android App Store apps as part of this. Now, IoT, I think we all know, is kind of a cesspool of lack of security, for lack of a better way to put it. And so there's actually this working group called IOXT that is largely funded by a lot of the IoT manufacturers, the ones that are reputable. And it's a standard where you can get a certification for your IoT devices. You can also get certification for a mobile app that connects to an IoT device, and it also uses the OWASP spec. So we've taken the work we've done with OWASP, work with other certification groups, bring that into a compliance model. And you're going to see more and more of this, I think, in the next couple of years. I also think you're going to probably see, at least in the US and probably in the EU, some regulations around application security, most likely. Apparently, I'm famous for on a panel in the US government yesterday, telling the world that the US government must pass a law on security. So we'll see what happens. We do a lot of work in the open source community. If you're reversers, you may have heard of Frida or Radari. So researchers who built Frida and Radari are on our team. So Ula and Pancake are part of the cabal we have here as part of our organization. If you want to explore reversing, there's plenty of resources you can learn about Frida and Radari from as well. Our pen testing team uses them. A lot of pen testing teams around the world use them, no matter what company you work with. But you tend to need to be a black belt to use them. So why am I here? So I joined Now Secure about 6 years ago, and having been in the sort of security space, I was more towards device, secure messaging, things like that would actually come in the BlackBerry world. And Now Secure had actually been doing pen testing for my other mobile companies. So I knew them from forensics, I knew them from pen testing and all the rest. And the founder showed me a data set where he scanned 1 million apps in the App Store and discovered that 85 to 90% of them failed at least 2 of the OWASP Mobile Top 10. He said that's a problem we're trying to solve. Is how can we have pen testing services, training, automated software scanning, whatever it is, so that we can move from 85% of the apps in the App Store have 2 or more vulnerabilities that fail the OWASP Mobile Top 10 to some number that's better than that. And so that's kind of where we are today. Now, one of the interesting things, if you're not mobile pen testing, or you haven't been around mobile, is that more internet traffic now runs through and from mobile devices than applications. More financial transactions in certain countries run on mobile applications, especially the second world and third world countries that just kind of leak past computers into the mobile device kind of realm. So about 70% of all that digital traffic now runs. So in your organization, if you have mobile and web as part of your business, odds are pretty good the mobile side of your business is at least as much traffic, if not more, than the web side of your business. I mean, there's companies like Uber, I took an Uber ride tonight, they're a customer, they're all mobile, right? A lot of other organizations here, TD Bank, for example, right? You know, financial transactions are more and more happening using mobile app than logging into the web browser PC. So we know that's all growing. We also know the data's really ugly. So this is always the fun part. So here are some of the more common apps that people might be using. Does anybody use any of these apps? I'm figuring you do, because everybody does. So I noticed downstairs there was like a Ring a doorbell. I don't know if that was Ring or not. I flew United to get here. MyFitnessPal tracker, shopping at 7-Eleven, Amazon shopping cart. Did you know in the last 2 years, all these apps were breached? These are big, well-known brands that have application security teams, may even have a mobile application security team. What we have discovered is that mobile is a much more brittle environment that has a larger attack surface that's harder to test. So what winds up happening is mobile innovation continues to drive forward, but teams don't have the skills or the tooling in order to keep up with the innovation and then continuously test them. Right? So it's a classic gap. When you talk to the guys at MyFitnessPal, most of their C-suite was fired. 150 million records were stolen. Story of MyFitnessPal was created by 3 graduate students at the University of Texas. They sold it to Under Armour. Under Armour never pen tested it when they bought it. Right? Just source. British Airways, largest fine in the history of Europe for GDPR. The fine was because of a mobile breach that led to their database. They stole millions of customer data, including credit cards and passports. The first big GDPR fine put teeth in GDPR, 158 million pounds that were fined. If you know your way about GDPR, that's a very large fine as a percentage of revenue. But they eventually arbitraged that number down. But those are some examples of the scope. I'm guessing most of you use Slack. Did you know there's been to Slack mobile vulnerabilities in the last 2 years. So, and they test their stuff pretty well too. So, if you want to learn more about any of the benchmark stuff I'm talking about, I put these big things in here so people can find them. We have a risk tracker. It actually continuously reports on the risks of the top 5,000 most popular apps in the Apple App Store and Google Play Store. We do not name names for all the obvious reasons that if you work for one of these companies, you don't want it to be a rolling, irresponsible disclosure, but give you a sense of kind of what's going on. And then we actually have a breach tracker, which is literally when someone makes the news, we put them on there. Now, the reason we actually do that is to help security teams when they go to the boss and say, we need to make sure we're not in the news. This is why these are the other people that are in the news and bad things that are happening. This is why we need to defend it. So it can help in terms of that. I will be sharing the slides so you all can click the links or chase the barcodes or what have you. OpenSSL, anybody freak out last week, 2 weeks ago when it first came out? So it was very exciting to know it was downgraded from a 9.8 down to a high but not a critical, right? You may have noticed that. Server side, it was limited to the absolute latest version, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we went in and we said, okay, we've got scan data for almost every app in the App Store. Let's go look and see how many are vulnerable to OpenSSL v3. Now, the vulnerability is primarily server side, so it's hard to tell from a mobile app how it's using server side, right? So we're like, okay, that's fine. 26% of the apps in the Apple App Store and Google Play Store are still vulnerable to Heartbleed. 26% of the apps in the App Store are still vulnerable to Heartbleed. And there's assorted other vulnerable versions of OpenSSL that were as famous as Heartbleed. So, touching everybody. All right, so when we think about mobile, a lot of what I do is working with our clients trying to bring development and security teams together so you can get a little bit of that flavor as I go through this. When we think about mobile, right? Development and the business are trying to run really fast, right? So we got companies that are crypto companies that went from 0 to $1 billion quickly. We've got transportation companies like Uber that grew like a weed, right? There's lots of different directions people are going when it comes to mobile. And usually innovation runs over the data, and that's where the problem, right? If you're here at an OWASP event, you understand sensitive data. But in front of developers, it's like, this isn't a security problem, this is a sensitive data problem. You need to know what sensitive data you have, you need to understand how you're using it. And one of the worst things about mobile is developers like to collect data and they store it on the mobile device. They store stuff on the mobile device they shouldn't be collecting. Oh, I might need it. Yeah, well, if you collect it, bad guy can get it, right? If you don't need to know geolocation, don't track geolocation, right? And if you do track geolocation, unless you're something like Uber, they're actually dependent on it, make it switchable so your user can turn it off and make it privacy. So we're going to drill in a little bit into kind of the mobile versus web world. So for me, I had a Unix PC software development tooling business in the 90s and kind of went through the mainframe to web, mainframe to client server web kind of scenarios and all the rest, right? And that where I was involved in Visual Studio, Visual Basic, Microsoft, and other development tools and so on and so forth. When I came into mobile, my first mobile was a little bit of Windows CE, and then I really got into BlackBerry. It was like completely proprietary architecture and all the rest. It was more like just making the argument why BlackBerrys were all locked down. Then I had to try to convince developers to write apps for Unix to run on a BlackBerry device. That was a lot harder because it wasn't developed in any way, shape, or form like any development environment that ever used. When we look at web versus mobile, the fundamentals of the differences in architecture are what causes the pain for both the developer and the security analyst, right? So again, I'm going to talk as if there's both developers and security people in the room. So if you think about web, there's some fundamentals, right? So I've got a browser. I can sort of count on some degree of consistency across browsers. There is an HTML spec that most people conform to. There is SSL. I can open up a two-way TLS communication between the browser and backend. There's configuration elements that aren't my fault. It's whatever the user sets in the browser that then I can take advantage of. The browser potentially could prevent me from storing anything on the device. The browser doesn't do verbose logging, right? Mobile's a whole different ballgame. So in mobile, the developer has to write all their own code. That includes writing their own network libraries. That includes writing their own storage. They're now responsible for a lot more of their own application's IP when you write a mobile application. So if the volume of code I write is 5 to 10x more to stand up and run a mobile app, guess what? The attack surface is much bigger, and the propensity to write that code is much larger, right? So the sheer volume, as we look at mass amounts of data that I'm going to walk you through about where we find vulnerabilities in coding errors, what you're going to see is some clear patterns in that. These are things we want you to take home to your development teams. But ultimately what winds up happening is the operating systems are constantly moving. Development languages are constantly moving. When I started working around this business, it was Objective-C, now it's Swift, right? There's going to be new languages next week and next year. A lot of people are working with Flutter and you have these intermediate languages, and the list goes on and on and on. And Apple and Google are trying to continue to innovate as well. And then there's all these third-party low-code, no-code tools like OutSystems and Appian and stuff like that, right? So now I've got all these languages, I got all these other things. I've got update rates that are much faster. I mean, when's the last time a browser went through an update that wasn't a security patch, right? But if you think about the mobile OSs, they're constantly moving, right? And to test, you need a physical device. So I can emulate a browser, I can do anything in a browser emulator. A device emulator does not handle all the physical I/O things that are related to a device. The sensors, the accelerometers, Bluetooth, right? There's not a Bluetooth feature in a browser, right? So all of those things create new kinds of attack surfaces, new levels of complexity, both for the developer to use them, and then for the security team to figure out how to test them. And so there's the first generation of mobile testing software was either reverse engineering tools that we talked about earlier, or emulator-oriented tools, and then this whole slew of stuff, right? So we got to figure out how to solve that problem. So the next problem becomes I got to jailbreak and root the device, right? So browser I can do whatever, PC I can do whatever, Unix or Linux I can do whatever, iPhone I got to jailbreak, got to root and Android device, new layers of complexity and everything else that comes with that. So we need to figure out how to tackle that. So when we look at the top 10s, we have retired the OWASP Mobile top 10 and turned it into something else I'm going to show you in a few minutes. But it's interesting to just kind of look at the differences between the two, right? Broken access control, cross-site scripting are always the things people tend to find. They both have crypto. When you look over here on the web side of the house, you got things like logging, but you don't have, where's network communication? It's not in there, right? Because the browser takes care of that for you. So when you look at these, you'll see they're materially different. There's some similarities, but there's just as much differences. So that's kind of was the birth of the OWASP MASVS and the OWASP Top 10. Let's go map what these differences are. If you actually want to really understand these, there's some short reading here, which is kind of like a high-level guide to walk a web pen tester, security analyst, or developer into here's your equivalents for mobile. Right? It's basically like a how-to guide. So when we think about mobile now, you probably have some sort of attack model that you would use to decide how you're going to pen test a web application. You're going to test the front end, and you're obviously going to test the back end and look at the network, and you crack open the burp suite and all that fun stuff, right? So when we think about mobile, we have the app itself, then we have all the infrastructure on the device, we have all the way down to the network level in the hardware, then you've got communicating through to cloud services. I have yet to see a mobile app that doesn't use a third-party cloud service, and eventually maybe to your data center, especially if you're a legacy business, right? So at all of these points, data can leak because the developer doesn't do it right, and all these points, the bad guys will attack it. So mobile testing, whether it's automated or pen testing, really needs to take into account all of these constraints, right, and all of these situations. And so when you look at the MASVS that I'm going to walk us through a little bit in the MSTG, you'll see a lot of very specific requirements related to how to code and how to test that have to do with the complexity of the attack surface. The other thing that you'll see is that we assumed when the mobile spec was originally built that mobile would have a unique backend. The reality is like 99% of applications use the same web backend and mobile backend. So we've taken what was the backend part with MASVS v2, we're just saying go use AAVS, just go use the other OWASP spec instead of basically trying to mirror it and keep up. So when you tear down that attack surface, remember I described how the architecture of web and mobile are different. You have the code you write, right? You have the architecture of the application itself. You have how data is used on the device. You have the backends it talks to. You have storage. And you have network, right? Now these are just a handful of examples of all the ways things can go bad in all of these different areas. So as we build a threat model, which is part of the OWASP MASVS, as we think about how we're going to build a testing program against it and ultimately how to train developers, we need to think about all these things. Right? These are all part of it. So as we drill into it, then if we're working with developers, it's how do they write good code in the app, how do they make sure they handle data at rest, how they handle data in motion, how they handle the API backend, right? And if you're writing a web application, it's how to have good app code and how to have a good backend. So these things in the middle are where we find most of the vulnerabilities because developers have to roll their own. more likely they are to roll their own, the more likely they can stay. Or if they go to some repo and download library X for storage and library Y for crypto, and you have no idea it's going to be any good, right? Usual cesspool. You guys know MITRE ATT&CK? Some of you know MITRE ATT&CK, right? So in 17, we started working with the MITRE team and realizing the same thing, that like the OWASP group, the MITRE ATT&CK needed to evolve because mobile was different and the attacks we were seeing for a while were different enough. So there is a MITRE mobile attack. Have a look at that. Again, this is, if you're in the web world and you want to learn mobile, it's a great place to go. You can go see the diffs between the two. It helps you learn where the modern attackers are coming from. If you happen to be doing some red teaming or offensive security, it's a great place to learn techniques, right, in order to go after that. And again, if you look at these words here, they're going to look like the same thing you saw in the web world. It's just profiling the differences, which is pretty cool. I put some examples in here. So we did, we've been doing a lot of government briefings, and we leveraged the MITRE ATT&CK because a lot of governments recognize MITRE as a good attack model. So these are actual breaches where we were able to figure out the attack vectors. So on the device, WeChat, OkCupid, and Malbus were all breached using attack through the app itself. Walgreens and Plenty of Fish is a dating app. These were attacked through the network, and then Under Armour and British Airways were through into the back end, but they were using the APIs from the app to the back end in order to do that. So that gives you kind of a sense of where some of the real bad things actually happen. So, check the time. There we go. We want to secure this thing and data on it. In a Wild West where there are hundreds of Android devices that you can't control, and then there's iOS devices you sort of can't control, right, from that perspective. So we need to think about app security testing and all the other things that go with it. So I'm going to jump over that real quick. So the OWASP mobile project has moved from the OWASP mobile top 10 into 3 companion documents. Sorry, I'll fix that. So the first document is really the MASVS, which is the Application Security Verification Statement. Give me 1 second. I think I opened the wrong deck. You just give me 1 second. Sorry. Did it not save my changes? So I worked on this on the flight. Didn't save them all. Oh well, it's okay. Gotta love reconciliation of Google Drive. So, the MASVS is basically the Bible. It establishes security architecture and best practices that's suitable for development security architects including, and so on and so forth in the baseline. And then over here, we have the testing guide itself, right? So this is more the cookbook for how testing can be done. And then to go with that, there's the actual checklist, just like the other OWASP specs. The MSTG and the checklist are now bound together in Git, which means anytime any of the MSTG changes, the checklist automatically changes. That binding is coming to the MASVS as well. You'll see that in the first quarter of next year. Now, the reason why I said, oops, so this has been renamed. It's actually now the Mobile Application Security Testing Guide, so it's MAMA as a pattern, small name. Now, it's going through a large refactor right now, which is part of the reason I'm doing a roadshow. I'm going to give you some of the fundamentals and then we'll drill into it. So the foundation of MASVS is basically a 4-box model. So when I think about threat modeling a mobile app, there's basically 4 boxes that I can drop things into and you can fine tune from there. So the first one is this notion of standard or minimum security. In the web world, there's also kind of an L1, right? So I'm going to use medical apps as an example. So you may know WebMD. It's basically like a lookup app. You know, what's this drug? What's this diagnostic or whatever else? No PII, no PHI, no account, minimal testing, if anything at all. Hopefully the data is accurate. Right? We used to use WebMD for children as a demo. It was a train wreck. Because that's where you can put your kids' information and save it. They definitely don't know what security is. So L2 is really your defense in depth, right? So this is an example of a health monitoring application. So this thing connects to body sensors. So if I have a scale at home, a Wi-Fi scale, it can suck in my data from like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or anything like that, right? So now I have PII and PHI in this thing, right? It's got an account, it's got cloud services, it's got a mobile app, it's talking to things in my house. So therefore, I want to secure that, right? Now, it's weight monitoring. So how scary is it if someone knows what my weight is? Scary. You don't want your health insurance to know. But it's not the end of the world, right? Now, remember I talked about how mobile apps run on the device. Now, when an app runs in the browser itself has a degree of hardening, but the back end of a web app is all behind layers of defense with a firewall, and you separate storage and logic and all the rest. In the mobile world, it's all on the device, so there's an entire category called resiliency. So not only do I have to write the code the right way, I actually have to try to make the app tamper-proof so that bad guys can't attack it. The problem's going to be the reversing tools are so good, they're going to be able to reverse just about anything. So now not only do I need to minimize the tamper capability, I also need to make sure there's no unique IP in the app and do that work on the server side. I also need to make sure that app collects as little amount of data as possible because the reverser is likely to find it. You follow my drift. So this is an architecture conversation as much as it is a testing conversation, designing it the right way. So Davis's drug guide is a very popular drug guide used by doctors and pharmacists to basically make custom drugs, right? So you may have need a specialty drug for whatever particular health condition you have. This is where it gets scary. It's read-only, has no PHI in it. What if a nefarious actor gets in there and changes the database? They could actually change the cocktail in it that could cause death, right? So you want to make sure that even though that doesn't have PHI in it, I actually need to protect the IP in it. So I'm going to make this app as resilient as I can because I don't want people messing around with drug cocktails because of the ramifications of that, right? And then my favorite one is I used to wear one of these, Medtronic, using that as an example, which is this is actually where I have a medical thing attached to my body providing insulin. It could kill me if somebody gets into it, right? You probably heard of insulin pumps like the ones that are on like a stand have been breached, but their mobile apps haven't by their customer. But this is where resilience really does matter. So now you're protecting not only the IP, but you actually want to make sure that no one can get in and manipulate it because of that situation. So when you look at something like the Tesla mobile app, which can move your car, right? There's a lot of apps that link in here. So we're going to come back to this a little bit, but this will guide our way through where do we need to test, how do we need to design and build, and all the rest. All the words I just said are basically here with some extra guides. So you need to understand how to perform and do proper certificate pinning and multi-factor auth. Over here, you need to do obfuscation, anti-tampering, and minimize the amount of IP, because of resiliency on the client side. So that's a little guide into the land of the MASVS. So when you dive into it, replacing the mobile top 10 now are the 8 chapters of the MASVS. And it really is pretty much cookbook-like. So there's the architecture, design, and threat modeling. If you want to get started, it's great threat modeling here. There's data storage and privacy, crypto, auth and session management, network, environmental, code, and resiliency. Again, some of these things are very unique for mobile, right? Resiliency exists because the app is on the device that can be tampered with, unlike the back end of a server web-based application. Network communication is the primary attack path for most attackers because they're remote. They don't need the device in hand in order to get there, right? And so on and so forth. Now, as we go through this, I'm going to teach you a little bit about these by showing you where people screw up with us. So that's the part that's fun. So I can take all these and I can map them all in here, right? So data at rest is crypto and storage. Data in motion is on the network. We've got the API top 10 and the ABS here for the back end, platform, architecture, resiliency, and code, right? So these things kind of all mesh together in a logical way. So imagine if you had a database of 6,000 apps in the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store, and then you ran a bunch of analytics on it, which is what we have. So behind the mobile risk tracker that we're running, that's about the 5,000 most popular apps in it. We're actually continuously scanning the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store, and a giant machine is basically running a ton of analytics. So under the hood, we're basically doing 600 tests on that stack of apps. So it's basically doing binary static analysis. We reverse analyze in static. Dynamic, it runs on a real device. It's got instrumentation injected into it for IaaS, and it probes the back end a little bit. It's not doing heavy back end, just probing it enough to see if proper authentication is occurring and things like that. So, and then you crank that as a machine and run that every day, every week, every time one of these apps gets updated, we go through the data. So we found 5 very clear patterns, right? And you can probably guess what most of them are, because I've kind of did a few. So because I often do this course with both developers and security teams, I'm going to give you both sides of the story. Can you excuse me for 1 second? It's like the 4th phone call from somebody trying to reach me. Hello? Yes, I'm in the middle of a presentation. You've called 4 times. Is this an emergency? Grace from where? Oh, very good. Can you call me back in about an hour and a half? Okay, thank you very much. Bye now. That was interesting. So my phone just kept ringing, like someone keeps calling me. It just says Golden Gate on the phone. And at OWASP next week, which is in San Francisco. So after the 4th time in a row, it's like it's a little burning down. Sorry. So builder and breaker, right? So imagine in the room, development team sitting here, security team sitting here, maybe there's a Java wall in the middle, maybe more friendly than that. Let's look at builder and breaker as we go through these. I usually ask the question, what is the worst one? And I forgot. So guess what the worst one is? Storage, right? Now, if you're in the web world or the network world, storage is almost not even relevant, right, to a large extent. So this is a really important thing for both developers and for the pen testing community to really understand. So barrel through millions of apps, 50% of them screw up storage, 50% of them. So if you're working in an organization and have a mobile team or not a mobile team, you want to do a little bit of mobile, just start snooping on storage. And I'll show you what happens here with a bunch of examples. So I'm going to walk through the top 5 here. That is the worst one. So each of these slides really are kind of a combo of training information. So I have whatever OWASP MASVS chapter is relevant. This will take you to the Git repo sections for those chapters. Then I actually have the Android and the Apple, that's funny, I should say iOS, the Android and the iOS developer documentation on that functional area. What's really nice about this is most of these sections, there's actually Apple and Google documentation that aligns nicely. So while you're saying, hey, it's got this crypto issue, they can go into the Apple documentation and see how they should configure the crypto, right? So it's a nice kind of companion set here, which is also making me wonder if my data tables at the end. So I may need to update this more. All right, so for secure coding, the biggest one is architecture. Don't store sensitive data, period, right? Assume it will be found some way, shape, or form. Make sure you encrypt anything that's nearly sensitive as part of it. Make sure query strings aren't buried in there because you can intercept those on the device. Each of iOS and Android have some secure storage APIs or configuration elements. You want to make sure you use those. Make sure you use strong crypto. We were talking crypto earlier. It's a pun, right? There's some really crappy crypto in these mobile apps. Secure random, and then make sure you have really long key lengths, right? Now, a lot of that may sound like sort of fundamentals. The biggest, most important one is don't store it. Just don't. Find out a way not to. The cost, a lot of these apps were written 5 or 10 years ago when the cost of a round trip was high. Developers say, oh, I don't want the round trip, I don't want the cost. It's like, no, leave it on the server. That guy's going to find it. So if you've got your banking app, there's no sensitive data stored on your device. Your banking app, you may notice that the only thing you might get is the last couple digits of your account number. That's international regulation saying you can't store an account number on the local device. And some apps you can't ever get to your account number. You got to find another way to get to it, right? Because of issues like that. So architecture is as big as anything here. Now, let's think about the testing. You're looking for creds and PII in the files all the time. We find things in logs. We find things in the IPC. Snooping on the device. You know, there's a zillion things you can find. The other thing on mobile devices, you probably noticed when you tab out, the app kind of goes in the background. Most application developers are smart enough to blank out the screen. Well, even if they blank out the screen, the data may still be in memory and accessible. So when they blank the screen or drop their logo on the screen, when you move into that tab mode in the background, make sure the data is also erased from memory using whichever iOS or Android APIs you need to. Try to check the crypto yourself, make sure it's strong enough. Make sure there's a device password. So a lot of users don't want to use a device password. Device password allows the brute force guys to get into your app more easily, right? So if someone actually has a device in hand, there's a password on it, it's easier for you the attacker to get in. It's a simple thing. Both iOS and Android actually have the ability to make an API call into the operating system if it doesn't have a device password on your app. Just don't let it run on a non-password device, and that will help you with layer of protection as well on your defense in depth. As I said, crypto is often very weak. We have a zillion findings for crypto because of all the mistakes that people have made. Guess what the second worst thing is? I am upside down. What's the second worst thing? Guess what? Network. Okay, so storage is I either need to have access to the device or I need to have an application adjacent to the production application that knows how to sniff data off the device, right? Something like that. Network is get anybody to get you anywhere, right? So insecure network communication is very common. It is only 2 points less. So 48% of all apps in the App Store have insecure network communication. 48%, right? Call it a tie. So there's an entire chapter on this one. The longest chapters is network, actually. iOS and Android both recognize the challenges here. There is a lot of documentation from Apple and Google to try to help the developer with that. At the Android world takes sort of the pro view, which is the network security configuration side. Apple takes the other, which is preventing a bad guy from attacking you, but they're good to learn. What we actually found interesting as well when we do hands-on coaching is if you've got an Android developer here and an iOS developer here, have them read both. Because we'll actually learn some techniques from each of iOS and Android in order to help secure the network as well. And I think we all know what this stuff is, right? So if you're pen testing and you find someone's using HTTP, not HTTPS, you're like, oh my God, go fix this stupid little, spelling error effectively. This you have to set up manually in the app yourself. You have to set up the two-way TLS communication. You have to know how to do certificate pinning and all those kinds of things. And that's where developers make mistakes. They weren't trained in how to do this, so they make mistakes more often than not. That basically allows all the data theft that happens over here. We have a little kit we often use with customers that's here's how to configure Burp to go prove the network vulnerability that we found, right? Because it's generally that straightforward to find most of these things. Again, we'll go back to the developer side and think about architecture, right? So are they generating the TLS session in the right order, right? So order of operation is just as important here as it is anywhere else. Cert pinning should be any L2 application should use certificate pinning. Most developers hate it, don't know it, don't understand it, you just screw it up. You also have to deal with your production team, because your ops team is responsible for the cert services and all that other stuff, and this becomes a place where like, yeah, it's such a pain in the arse, I'm not going to do it. Hence, if they don't do it or they don't do it right. When we test the certs, we're going to test the certs 4 different ways. Self-signed cert, unsigned cert, improperly signed cert, expired cert, all those things. So it's not just using certs, it's using them the right way, which also can be a common mistake. Now the good news is that around iOS 7 and Android 8 or 9, Apple and Google said, enough already, we're going to put APIs in for this stuff. So in iOS, ATS, App Transport Security, if the developer invokes that API, automatically all network communication will be encrypted over TLS time. Automatically. When we scan millions of apps in the App Store, 30 to 40% of them disable ATS and use something else. On the Android side of the house, there's Android network security communication. It's the same thing, right? So as long as they configure that correctly, it basically forces the two-way TLS encrypted communication back, right? So again, both sides, both operating systems and development environments have them. When you look at the NSC, you have the same kind of thing. About a third of applications don't use it, they turn it off, they use something else. Now, some of this has to do with history, because the reason I mentioned the version dates was if you've got a really old app that someone wrote for iOS 5 and it's just been doing incremental updates, they would have had to do the roll their own, right? So that's why some of these old apps still have old libraries. How often do you go clean something up? You're not going to unless there's a reason, right? So if you bump into network issues in an older application or somebody using an older library, say, hey, this is actually pretty straightforward to switch to the newer APIs. Then you have to do some recoding of their application to make them work, but you get to take advantage of everything. Apple and Google have continued to improve those APIs as well as technology has evolved. So you basically inherit all their improvement over time. And then teach them how to prevent an man-in-the-middle attack. So one of the best exercises you can do, and you may have tried this already in the web world, is sit them down, crack open Burp, use an unencrypted connection, and show them what a bad guy can find. Once they see that, they're like, oh, now I understand. Because most of them just don't understand that notion of intercepting the traffic. Right? So test TLS, look for cert pinning, test for all kinds of cert pinning, make sure it was done right. The other thing to look for is zip files in transit. A lot of developers will try to create a thin application, and they will put logic in the zip file and download it dynamically. If the communication is not properly pinned, the nefarious actor can grab the zip file, replace it with alternative logic, and then the user winds up using basically malware by replacing the zip file. So as a fundamental architecture, they should not transmit logic over the air down to the device. It should be pre-installed on the application. And if you need to update the logic, use the classic over-the-air updates, standard Apple update type scenarios. And try not to use zip files at all. The bad actors are always sniffing for, is there a zip file in that? Is there a zip file in that? Is there a zip file in that? We'll use that to see if they can, once they discover that, they'll use that to try to figure out if they can get in. Check to see if ATS and SCO have. The great thing is you can just go look at source code. Is it in there? Scan the repo. Is it in this? And then obviously you want to runtime check that it actually happens. And then the other thing we tend to find, and when I talk about 40 to 50% have this issue, many times your developers did the right thing. It's the third-party libraries that did. So we've had some really interesting ones with some of the ad networks where they didn't secure communication. They might say ad network, I don't care. Well, guess what? It's grabbing your INDI, it's grabbing your geolocation and other things and transmitting it back to the ad network, right? So an actor can start tracking you and combine that information with other information to get to something that's possibly worse about you. So you want to make sure that those third-party libraries are clean. The good news is that some of them are better than others. All right, the third one, I'm going to give you a break from all the depression of you're never going to use mobile app again because storage and networking stinks. This is authentication, right? And I think we all are very worried about is authentication and authorization happening properly, right? So early on, this was a train wreck. But if you look at the data from the last 2 years, it's actually much better. So only about 14% of the apps in the App Store actually exhibit a failure in this area, which is actually really good news. So there are going to be other bad ones that we go through, but it's there. So again, authentication and session management is different on an iOS or Android device than a web browser. So there's a whole chapter on that. Android and Apple have some really good user authentication documentation you can point your developers back to, and help them understand why this is bad. The good news is most developers understand why they didn't do this the right way. The other thing we find is not enough use of multi-factor auth, right? The good news, whether you like Face ID and biometrics or not, that's actually raised the bar to enable a lot of apps to have multi-factor auth where they couldn't code it themselves. So they're taking advantage of what Apple and Google put on the device and using that. Now, years ago, people used to ask me, are they safe? The answer is, have you heard of an Apple breach using the camera? No, neither. It may be possible, but no one's been able to breach any of these biometric things. So convince your developers to go take advantage of it. It's actually faster for the user, right? Scan the thumbprint with my face, it's just faster. I talked earlier about session management, right? So when that application goes in the background, you want to make sure you terminate the session. It's going to be too long. There should be some timeout on that, right? Because the bad actor is going to be hammering around in that background trying to find their way in, make the session go away. When you invalidate the session, make sure you invalidate the data that goes with it. You clean up your own memory. And then when you're doing authentication, so we had an organization we were working with, and they were getting wave after wave of, words just slipped out of my head, users use basically credential theft. And what they worked their way backwards to is they were doing permissioning on the client side. And because they were doing it on the client side and the server side, they were finding everybody in, right? You get access on the back end. So again, things like complex calculations should happen on the back end, and anything that's really sensitive IP, the authentication cycles, everything should be on the back end. So the main things really here are just looking to see if there's PII left anywhere in memory and making sure sessions are properly validated and invalidated, depending on when the application is running and what it's doing. Insecure coding practices is a giant bucket of all the stuff we hate that developers do, right? So like web and any other development environment, there's a whole smattering of these guys that I'm going to kind of rip through here. The last time we ran this, it was 47%. Notice the numbers are still really big. Now, because this is a bucket of a lot of things, you got to kind of sub-segment it into some smaller buckets, and I'll talk about a couple of them coming up here. So when I looked at some data a couple weeks ago for a different project, something like 8% of the apps in the App Store still had debug code. Right? Go figure. So there's actually a whole very large document on code quality. Apple and Google think they have enough documentation, so there's nothing I can point you to other than the general docs, and that's why you would get the OWASP listing here. Vulnerable third-party libraries tend to be loaded into this. Some of the memory leak things are here. Debug features, extra security controls, the backdoors, all those kinds of things, right, that developers do. Code quality could just simply be when you move towards prod, change from verbose to in-verbose logging, find some things like that, right? Again, you can find that in the web world as well. But that's really worth a good read. I think the more you're able to talk with developers in a developer way and explain some of these code quality issues, the better. The spec on code quality is pretty well written. It does point back to Apple and Google documentation a little bit in some areas to remind people what to do. So code quality is there. So what do we look for? I mean, one of the primary things we do when we're doing pen testing or advisory work is, do you actually have a documented set of security requirements in the first place? And do those security requirements also include hygiene, which is really what a lot of these things are. Are you properly removing debug symbols, et cetera, et cetera? Try to use some of the features that are in there that will protect your app from attacks. So stack protection and ARC there's a set of APIs in the Android and iOS, more in Android, that are basically anti-tampering APIs. So take advantage of those, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about reversing in a second, but take advantage of those, right? To prevent things like stack smashing in the app. And then track the third-party vulnerabilities that the whole world is laying up over the notion of SBOM and SCA. You really need to do that. Again, a lot of the insecure code we find does actually come from third party. Third parties aren't necessarily motivated in the same way you might be. So the guy who writes a library for some GUI visualization doesn't work for a bank. He didn't care, right? So he might grab a piece of data, send it off to a server, it does something with it, and generates a piece of graphics for you. Well, little do you know that all that data is all going on encrypted, et cetera, back and forth. And someone might be able to triangulate that with other data. Make sure the app is signed with this valid cert. Make sure it's not a debug build. Hard-coded keys. We've had a bunch of automated testing around hard-coded keys. Again, that's a common one you probably see. Error conditions are another phenomenal way, as I'm sure you found in testing other kinds of technology. Error conditions we find stuff all the time. Because in an error condition, the developer starts dumping more data, right? Then you be careful that it doesn't have PII, PHI, unique IP, certain calculations, things of that nature that they can dump. We'll get stuff like, it's this device and this geolocation with this phone number and showing up in the logs, right? And it was a nascent issue, but it was so verbose that bad guys will drive. The attackers have learned that verbose logging is a great source of data, so they're going to try lots and lots of error conditions, not just to get in, but because of the logging that often occurs, especially when they get it off the device. Like I said, it's like the fourth slide that says check third-party libraries. It may not be your people, maybe it is. So last one is reverse engineering. So this is a world that does not exist in the web in the same way. Go back to the first principles. I've got an iOS device, I've got an Android device, it's jailbroken or rooted, I've got Frida and Radari or R2 Frida on it, a couple other instrumentation things, got Burp turned on. I'm going to tear this thing down and find out everything I can, right? Every banking app in the App Store, guys like Uber, transportation, airlines, they got giant bullseye in their head, so they're all getting attacked continuously. I was at a CISO roundtable in Wall Street 2 months ago, and it was really funny because one guy said, yeah, we get like 10,000 attacks a day. It's something to someone else at the table. There was another vendor talking about something. They said, how many mobile do you get? You kind of pause. So I have no idea. I said, you actually have no way to measure that, right? So you could try to measure it by setting up a different set of APIs on the back end for your mobile apps, so you can see, well, when they get those APIs, these are going after your app, your mobile app, and not sharing your web APIs. So when API test them, you do something like that, but oftentimes you can't tell, right? And there isn't really any effective RASP or anything else. So you got to make the app itself as tamper-proof as possible to the degree you can. So if I'm going to do that, 1/3 of the apps have the issue. On iOS, Apple will DRM wrap your binary when it downloads onto the device because they want to imprint it to say, this is Brian Reed's version of Uber on an iOS 15 device, right? Boom, right? But that doesn't really make it anti-tampering. It just makes it a little harder. It's like a speed bump that takes an hour to overcome, right? So there's DRM stripping tools out there, a bunch of them on the market that are free that people can use and then quickly start trying to reverse the application. So Apple gives you some protection. So the majority of the 32% tend to be more Android driven, right? In terms of mass scale analysis here. And as we get into that, there's a whole section on resiliency and anti-tampering to really give developers strategies on how to tackle reverse engineering and understand reverse engineering so they can make their apps more resilient. 50% of it is architectural, the rest of it is coding techniques. Now, I don't know if any of you participated, but OWASP has a reverse prevention project as well that's, I don't know how active it is right now, but it was pretty active during the early days of COVID. And then the top reversing tools are there if you want to have fun with reversing. There's the ones I talked earlier about our guys created, right? So the big thing about reversing is actually IP theft. That's the big thing, right? So we had a customer who came in and was freaking out because people were generating their own discount coupon codes. And I think it took our pen tester 30 minutes to find that the algorithm for computing coupon codes was on the client side, not the server side. And so someone had lifted that up and dropped it on the dark web, and people were just generating coupon codes all over the place for these guys, right? That's an architectural thing. It's not that the developer wrote bad code. They wrote it in the wrong place, right? So one of the things that we wind up doing is spend a lot of time in the architectural strategy of do as little as possible on the device. Do as much as you can on the server side, right, for that reason. So then there's less things for me to protect on the server side as well. So with this, I always like to say the following. So try to use the built-in anti-tampering APIs and third-party tools, right? There's like free stuff like Guard Square out there. You can use a little bit of that. They'll slow most people down. The nation states will still get past them, right? Like anything else. Almost anything you're going to have on your perimeter defense, the nation states are figuring out ways through it. But most of the other guys, a lot of the criminal gangs, you can probably protect yourself from by using the third-party tools out there. One of the great tools that Android came out with in 10 or 11 was the SafetyNet API. So SafetyNet API checks to see if the device or the operating system have been tampered with. Basically, is it jailbroken, rooted, soldered, whatever. You can put that at the load time, your developer can put that in the load time for their Android application. If it detects a jailbroken, rooted devices, it will upload the app, nothing will ever happen. So Apple doesn't have the equivalent, Google does, and they realized because it was easier to reverse on Android that this was a worthwhile addition. So SafetyNet API is in there. It will drive people nuts. You may have customers who like to have rooted iOS devices with custom experiences. There's a whole thread on, so McDonald's got breached. Did you guys hear about people were buying hamburgers with other people's McDonald's accounts? This was like 3 years ago, 4 years ago. So they reversed it and figured out how to do that. So McDonald's implemented SafetyNet API, and I think Google used that story at one of their events, or one of the joint cons, I think they talked about it. And the whole underground of people that like to customize their Android devices freaked out because they couldn't order McDonald's. Because McDonald's said, we've been brute force attacked so many times, we're just not going to run on a rooted device or jailbroken device. So that's an interesting strategy, right? You might actually give up some customers. So that was a business decision that the risk and the harm of allowing it to run on those devices versus gaining or losing those customers was a material issue to them. So they made that choice. Disclosure, they are a customer of ours. So anyway, take advantage of those techniques. So when you're testing, there's 8 or 9 typical calls that an iOS app can make to see if the device has been jailbroken. There's not one, like the SafetyNet API. Just go look and see if your team, if your developers made those 8 calls, right? And that's in the documentation to tell you how to do that. And then look and see if SafetyNet API is in the app, right? So part of this is check source code, SafetyNet API turned on. If it's not, then have a dialogue, educational dialogue about, hey, we should block people and rooted devices from running our application. There's an easy way to do that. Let's put this in one time, right? Test to string tables and methods are also places where we find data all the time, right? Again, classic place to go looking. So The funniest thing is when I have this conversation, which is, oh, we're wrapping the app. Don't worry about it. So loading in guard square or one of the ArcSan or any one of these wrapping techniques or obfuscation techniques doesn't hide a network vulnerability, doesn't hide a storage vulnerability, doesn't slow down the attacker enough to be able to find those. So yes, you want to do it, but anti-tampering doesn't fix those security issues in the first place. And sometimes we have these arguments with development teams like, oh yeah, we got to totally solve. We bought this thing and it's going to wrap it, and now it's going to be like in a hermetically sealed something, relate data. And 10 minutes later, we show them release data, right? So it's a good architectural strategy to include it, but also teach your team on what all that means. All right, everybody still wait?
Yeah.
So you're going to get the slides. They have a zillion links in them, right? If you want to learn from this. Part of what excites me about coming out and doing this is for 5, almost 6 years I've been part of Now Secure. We have been trying to hire more developers, trying to hire more pen testers and so on and so forth. We found we had to grow people in terms of the mobile pen testing side of the house. When I sit down with, a Fortune 100 CISO and talk about how their app is vulnerable, and we show them a live attack, and they're like, yeah, but we don't care. It blows my mind, right? So we're trying to help the groundswell with you all have sort of the evidence and the understanding, help you say, hey, go back, do we have a mobile team? Are we doing something for mobile? Does our company have a mobile app, and are we addressing issues in those mobile apps, right? It may sound like a lot, but it's actually not very hard. We built a 3-hour training course. It's online, it's free. It will teach your developers how not to make the 5 mistakes I just described. Give them that link, walk away, I bet your code gets better, right? So we're trying to solve the dev problem by creating dev tools to support you in that conversation. Most of that stuff's free, and you like it in a few minutes. So if you want to become a mobile pen tester, you can play the role your own. So I've got links to all the repos here. There's a really cool hacking playground where you can learn a lot. Freedom or Dari are here. You'll need Burp or Zed or somebody for the networking side of the house, and you need some jailbroken and rooted devices, right? You can find that stuff on eBay and whatever else, and learn how to install the city or what have you. And there's a lot of really cool stuff that goes there. For years and years, we ran a 4-day course at Black Hat on how to do this. We stopped doing it just because it was so much work to do it, but there's resources out there on the internet, and we got something we can share with you on how to do that. You can also buy stuff. So they're Now Secure, and a couple other companies provide commercial software to help you do these kinds of things, and there's some links to that if you want to have a look at it. One of the things we try to do, so if I go back to that history, we were mobile forensics. We went into mobile pen testing. We couldn't find pen testers. So what do? You take the ones you have, and you make them more productive. You start building tools, and I'm sure a lot of you kind of built your own scripts and tools or whatever else. So we moved along. About 1.5 years later, we got this thing called Workstation. It's basically a MacBook running a Linux VM on it, and we actually manipulated the Linux, Santuku Linux on it. Took a bunch of commercial tools like Burp and other tools in there, wrote a bunch of our own scripts, a bunch of our own tools. We're like, hey, we got this kit thing. And with that kit, one of our pen testers could take a 2 to 3 week pen test and turn it into about 2 days. Because it automated a lot of work. Like I talked about cert pinning, we automated 4 types of cert pinning. Like boom, push a button, and 5 minutes later, we tested all 4 kinds of cert, right? So we're like, wow, this is really cool. Now we can hire anybody and teach them how to be a pen tester, and that's a bit of how we grew our services. So we're at a bank, and they pull it out, because we're doing like a live demo of the bones we found, and the bank looks at the box and says, can I buy that? So we became a software company and said, oh, we could take that thing and package it up and sell it. And that's this Workstation toolkit here. So it's got Burp and Freedom and Dari and a bunch of other tools in it. It's like a wizard-driven thing, so I can take like a 2 or 3 week pen test and do it in like 2 days. One half of the time is you work through wizards to test certain things. The other half of the time is it's building the data set that you can create the report out of on the other end. So that was really cool. So then same bank, 3 years later, says, can you take that thing my guys are using and put it in the cloud to get rid of the humans? We're like, okay. Now fun work. And so our platform was born, which is basically a cloud automated version of most of it. We do 80% of the pen testing in the cloud now. Does it replace human ingenuity? Does all the grunt work. 4 types of cert validation. Looks at crypto, looks at storage, scours the device for any kind of PII or sensitive data on the device as tests are running, all kinds of really cool stuff, right? So we have a lot of pen testers that use that to do a quick scan and say, all right, I can check off all these things are done. Now I'm gonna go do the hard stuff over here. Or wait, this shows some exposed data here. Let me pull on that string in my manual pen testing to figure out how that happens, right? Because we all know you can't automate everything. You just got an alert. Emergency alert.
Yeah.
Ontario alerts. Tell me if I need to stop. Anyway, so let's go back and say, okay, so I actually want to build a program and I'm going to test applications like this. Well, how do I go about doing that? You guys probably have one of these too, classic tiered risk model, right? So when we work with organizations, we try to get them to think about the golden triangle and okay, if it's like the WebMD and there's no sensitive data, there's a strategy. A lot of times we're trying to teach people to think about the sensitive data that's your user data and sensitive IP. Many instances, developers and security teams they think about the data but not the IP so much. The IP is an issue because of reverse engineering on the device, right? And it's fundamental to the architecture of how the application was written in the first place. And then of course you have things like critical and life or death. And so to go with that, we recommend the following. So use some sort of automated scanning. You should have a CA in there and whatever else, right? You should be doing code reviews. Remember, a number of the examples I gave you are you using this API? Code reviews to find that stuff, right? Full scope if it's high risk, periodic scope, whatever the right thing is, as you go through the cycle. But again, when I do this class, oftentimes half the room is development and they don't understand any of this. So this is like a 1 hour long conversation of what all this stuff means, right? Unless they're a bank or something. We should be crypto. That's what you get for telling me to quit. So some key takeaways then. So mobile is a great place to make money. We've seen that mobile pen testers get paid more than web pen testers. So that's something to think about. It's a smaller size population of people, right? So it's the law of supply and demand that drives that up. Leverage the OWASP mobile project. At this point in time, we have had customers literally use the OWASP stuff and some of our online training and build grade A pen testers in like a quarter. So there's a lot of tooling and knowledge out there that you can leverage to make your team productive from that perspective. The other thing that's great is you can use this stuff to build security champions inside of engineering, right? So we've had a number, we did it at our user conference in the past fall, or in the spring and in the fall. We had 2 presentations that were security champions programs. And along with the many things you put in Security Champions program was the Security Champions became advocates using the MASVS architecture inside of the development teams. And so they were working at architecture level, teaching them some fundamentals, which made for better code, right? And so Security Champions can use this stuff really well. They are usually your engineers that are security leaning. Threat modeling is your friend. Read the threat modeling manifesto. The nice thing about the MASVS chapter 1 is it's got a complete threat model for mobile. It's got the whole thing, everything you never wanted to know. And then you don't have to test anything. If you're going to learn from a building perspective, or if you're a breaker, start with the ones I talked about. If you just do storage and network, you'll nail 90% of what we find, right? You can see the other ones, come back to them later. The other thing I would suggest you do is if your team is building mobile apps, make sure there's no IP on the client side. That's another place that's low-hanging fruit for bad guys. And I tried to give you some examples of things we found. Now, I'd love to have you get involved in the OWASP mobile project. So the things I talked about earlier, just the automated testing, the pen testing, and the training, that's kind of what we do. And people can take advantage of any of that within their organization. So the reason I'm on tour this fall is because the whole MASVS project has been going through a major upgrade. So you remember in 15, we got together, in 17, we published version 1, so on and so forth. Well, it's time for V2 after some small increments. The V2 refactoring is nearly done. We had hoped we'd have MASVS V2 RC for OWASP next week. It's not quite there. There's still a few arguments. It is great community activity. Still a few arguments trying to iron out. So the RC will probably be January, and it'll be ratified by the end of January. And we'll be done. Now, what's cool about this is Apple and Google are involved. A lot of the top app manufacturers are involved, not just us. Samsung's involved, as an Android manufacturer, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of really good alignment around this. So when I talked about things before, I talked about Arch, storage, crypto, auth, network, platform, code, and whatever I just dropped.
I don't think you dropped anything.
Yes. What is that?
Oh.
So 3D printed.
A dinosaur.
3D printed dinosaur, anybody?
Charmander.
All right, if you want to get involved in the refactoring, though, you can jump right into the active project. It's actually been really good. It's mostly done, but you can see all the diffs. So what happened? Wow, that's small. So architecture. What we realized was that OWASP, SAM, and NIST already have great architecture guidelines, including mobile. So the chapter now says, link to this document, link to that document, go read these, here's the mobile chapters, take that forward. So the V8 is going to collapse to V7 from the prior list because of ARC. We also realized that we had commingled storage and platform together. And so we re-rationalized those, and we give a little bit of an example of that here in the background. Crypto, fully aligned with NIST standards around crypto. So if you're following those, it makes it easy. Auth, remember I made a comment before, part of it's client side, part of it's server side. Why try to keep up with the ASVS on the server side stuff in our own docs? Why not just link to what's going on in the API project and the ASVS and just link to that? Just pull all that out, which is like half the requirements. The network was very complicated. I talked about 4 types of cert pinning, for example. The test coverage and documentation was pretty opaque. We had a lot of developers say when they read it was still too complicated. Pen testers could figure it out, typically because of their skills. So we really simplified network into a more effective way to understand, develop, and test. MASVS code had a bunch of things about securing the SDLC, like proper use of tokens, and don't store hard-coded keys and stuff like that. We just took it out and said, this doesn't belong in our spec, this lives elsewhere, right? And there is an SDLC process in OWASP program as well. And then resiliency, we tried to clean it up as well. Again, resiliency and network were 2 places where developers said, this is still too opaque, I still don't understand, this still is not really helping me. So we worked a lot with those development teams to try to streamline those. The other thing is we had a whole bunch of stuff that we put at a higher levels of requirement that was really just test cases. A lot of arguments like, why is this a requirement? Shouldn't this be a test case? So there's, when you actually look at it now, the MASVS list of requirements is less than half what it was. And that actually makes it easier for everybody to implement, right? If you take things that live somewhere else and you say, hey, just use the ADS for this, that's one way to shrink it. But also, when you have twice as many or 3 times as many network and resiliency requirements that are confusing and sometimes conflicting because of the classic community behavior, let's go make those easier, right? If I can tell developers 4 things you need to know, that's way easier than 16, right? So that was part of the philosophy of simplifying. So here's kind of an example where what we've tried to do is go back to the fundamentals, your code, internal, external, key store, and all the rest, and say, okay, we want a simple set of storage requirements. Now, in MASVS v1, this sheet had a grid that was about 16 rows long and about 20 columns wide, right? So now it's very simple. Simple set. MSTG is very simple right here. And then over here, there's a bunch of optional things depending on how you build your application. So I'm not going to go into all of these other than to say this is a visual example of trying to simplify things down across storage. The other really cool thing is automation. So today, most of us test this way, right? The human does stuff, puts it in a doc or Excel or whatever, and writes a report, right? So what if we said there's a standard output that could be generated by tools that can test it a certain way. We can actually specify how to write a test, as in encode a test in JavaScript, and then have it output in a standard way and make it machine readable. And that's what's coming next as sort of V2.1. So what we actually did in the refactors, we said, why don't we make sure that at least MASVS L1 and as much of L2 can be automated using current technology. What can you not automate? Auth. No one's built capture bypass yet. You can't automate MFA, right? There's a whole bunch of other stuff you can automate. So what's happened now is that this sort of V2 is now allowing this compliance as code model. So when I talked about IoT, that's what IOXT is doing with it. When I talked about privacy, that's what Google ADA is doing with it. So on this foundation, by the way, there's a healthcare thing in flight as well. I think it's in Europe, not the US, one of the countries in Europe. So the idea now is that I can get to machine readable machine readable input and output, and I can align with other specs and do it in an automated fashion. So about 1 month from now, we're going to announce a 100% automated version of OWASP MASVS with no human involved except for auth. If you multi-factor auth, you can't do that. You do everything else, right? So part of this was shrinking the spec and simplifying it, clarifying the test cases, and then writing the test cases in a way that says, if it's possible to automate this in some way, let's see if it's possible to do that. And so write the case in that way. There are many places where it's like, a human must do this. Well, it's not automatable. Right? So it's actually pretty exciting because if we think about what that means, now you can build automation into a build pipeline. Now you can test and give fast feedback loops to the developer when they make mistakes, right? So in the end, the quality of the code should inherently go up if you just plug this thing into the pipeline. Remember before I talked about the SDLC integration. Part of the team here is also working on the SDLC security spec for OWASP. So we're trying to align with those two and enable the automation in a secure way, which is actually really pretty cool. So if you want to play, there's a giant QR code. We'd love to have you get involved. Like I said, V2 is basically done, but you can go dumpster dive in it and learn about it if you want to. Help us get started on the next one, the next wave for next year. Now, still not done yet. So Apple and Google changed the rules, if you hadn't noticed. So they both now have data safety labels. No other software on the planet has data safety labels. So think about this. Apple and Google have a natural choke point, which is the only way to distribute your mobile app is to go through the Apple App Store or Google Play. Now there's side loading and whatever else, but you're not going to get millions of customers with side loaded apps. You're not going to build $1 billion business. If you're Citigroup, you're not going to say, hey, you got a side loaded app. Use Citigroup, right? I guess you'd say T-Bank or something. So they now have basically privacy labels and certification regimes, which is actually really pretty cool. So I don't know if any of you have ever looked into it. It's very interesting to look into these. Now the good news is that there's data here that is useful for decision making. The somewhat challenging news is it's self-attested. So Apple and Google are doing spot checks. We have had customers who have had and heard of organizations who had feedback, hey, we spot checked and I think you entered this piece of data the wrong way. You don't do this way, you do this that way. But what Google's done is taken it a step further. So let's take a look at the privacy nutrition labels. So here's a giant privacy nutrition label that they're actually, literally, if you Google on Apple privacy nutrition label, you get this. So it's basically, how is the data collected? How is it used to track you? What's it linked? And so on and so forth. It's all part of the Apple privacy cycle, right? There's some new stuff that they just came out with a few weeks ago. It's got basically privacy cutoff. So now at the Apple layer, you can cut off trackers and things like that as well. So they're continuing to enhance it. I realized that my copy over the other slide didn't get it here, so I'll have it later. So that's a great thing for end users to be able to go and just cut off. You know, any tracker that does this or any behavior that does that, I'm not allowed the app to do it, or the app will work if it tries to do it and doesn't have a soft landing. What Google did, because they were working in the OWASP project, said, what if we created a standard using OWASP that was a certification? Because OWASP doesn't certify. I said that earlier, OWASP doesn't certify. What if we have one? So it now exists. There's something called an ADA verification that you can get, which is a certification for the Android store. So underneath the hood, it uses MASVS and MSTG. And now in your label, here's my Android label, there's a badge that says independent security review. So what happens is the Android developer comes to one of 5 labs, says I want to be certified. Lab does the certification. Most likely they fail. Tell them how to fix it. Run it again. Then they pass. Then the lab sends the test results to both the developer and to Google. In 24 hours, Google adds the badge. This year, it's once. So meaning, when you get your first one, it will last 12 months. At some point in the future, that's going to turn into what they're calling major releases, and I don't know how they're going to codify that. What they want to get to using compliance as code is have the Google Play Store automatically scan the apps before they go in, and if they pass MASVS L1 or L2, depending on the risk of the app, let it in. So I think we're eventually going to get to a highly secure environment there. We'll see if Apple goes that route as well. So this is actually some really cool stuff. If you heard basically what I said, the industry, as we all know, is using OWASP as standards. OWASP MASVS has become kind of the cornerstone of what mobile is. Now you've got Apple and Google and the handset manufacturers saying, yeah, we're all going to use that as our security standard, which is a great way to raise the bar. Right? So we're pretty excited about these kinds of things happening now. So there's a bunch of links in here if you want to learn about it. So it's also, right now you might say, why would I do it? So there's sort of 2 or 3 reasons why you do it. First reason you want to do it is to show users you safeguard their trust. So like Disney does it, because Disney wants people to see that their brand is about safety. We have some crypto and banking apps that do it because they want to show people they can trust them as a bank, right? So that's the first thing. Second reason for doing it actually is a liability thing. So there's already been one case where an organization used this as a defense when they were breached. So if you're familiar with proof of controls, we had controls in place, we used an industry standard, we got independent verification, we still got breached, we did our duty. You're right, you did your duty. You should not be fined for that. See where I'm going? So in any regulated industry, this will give an organization basically a legal defense that said they did the right thing. It's the industry standard way to do it. There's a standard verification done by an authorized lab that must be certified. We followed that. We still got breached. It was an edge case. Right? So there's some good economic reasons for organizations to do it as well. Oh, this is just a picture. So when you open the Android ADA, what you'll actually see is a table that looks like the OWASP table because it is. You see MSTG everywhere. Right? So literally, it's got a veneer that says Google ADA, and then you open the dock, and it's all OWASP MASVS and MSTG inside of it. So they're not a one-for-one. Android has specified a few things that are Android operating system specific. They also took a few things out that they said, you know what, we're not going to make that minimum bar for version 1. They didn't want the hurdle to be so high, right, and block so many apps. So SBOM. So are you guys, anybody working with SBOMs? Yeah, it's common. US, it's going to be a law. Software's going to have to come with software bill of materials. Might as well learn about it a little bit. There's a really great flagship project for this. That's a great place to go and learn. The crew, Steve Sprague and Patrick Dwyer, are doing fantastic work here. CycloneDX was its own entity and then it merged into OWASP, as I said earlier. But if you want to have fun with SBOMs, our founder has been talking to many developers and security teams. They're like, I don't know what an SBOM is. I don't care. People talk about it, but I don't think it matters to me. So he's now on his personal blog going bonkers with developers and SBOMs and all the rest. So I encourage you to have a look at that as well. There's a QR code here to link to it. But what he's been trying to do is help developers recognize that, hey, it's actually pretty easy to understand what an SBOM is. It's pretty easy to generate one. But this is how you'll understand what's really going on in your app, right? And obviously, the SBOM is a baby of SCA. SCA is the, not only do I find the libraries, but I know which ones are vulnerable. But it's a crawl, walk, run way to get more developers to come down the path. So it's a pretty cool video series he's been working on here for the last few months. And then if you really want to do it, anybody's organization's dancing in the same big world. So if you haven't seen this project, it's really interesting. If you want to get into management, it might be a way, especially in a regulated industry, to have at it. This is the big way to really have a quality assurance model for regulated industries. So we see the banks working on this. We see some healthcare groups. Some federal agencies are doing this as well. It looks complicated, but actually, like NIST 800-153, it maps it out the way you can consume it. So, more resources. So, I mentioned training. We have 600 hours of free online training in Secure Academy. Whether you're a web pen tester, want to learn how to be a mobile tester, if you've got a mobile development team, you want to teach them security skills, this is where that 3-hour class is I mentioned that has the 5 that I just talked about. That's all free. You can have that. There's one small paid corner, which is if you want to get a certification, like a SIA certification, then you pay for that. Basically, you take a test, you get these paid. Eventually, we'll have CPE credits. We're not there yet. We do spring and fall events. In the spring, we do a physical event that's training. In the fall, we do a virtual event. We just had our Stranger Bones Halloween Day virtual event. So that it's available on demand here. This has a bunch more training in it too. Yeah, this stuff's all everything we do is free for training. So you can have some fun in that. There's some pretty cool replays in there. If you're working in a Security Champions program, there was a really great if you are the guy who created Google ADA is in there if you want to learn about that. Sven and Carlos, who are the OWASP spec leads for the mobile project, they were there as well. And then we actually have free tools. Remember I talked about that big database in the sky? So you can go in and say, hey, give me 10 free SBOMs, or give me a free security report, and we'll do some processing and come back if you want it. You have to tell us what you want it for, so there's an interaction with one of our security people to figure out what app you want. Whether you give us your own binary or you pick something out of the App Store, you can get some results out of that, give you some sense of what you can find. And there's some other fun stuff here. Also, we've got a couple of new CrackMe. There's new Android CrackMe that came out of R2Con this year. It's pretty cool. So I think I'm finally done. So, thank you. All right, I'm happy to take any questions. I don't know if that's easy for people online. Hope I didn't bore you all to death. Yeah.
So yeah, that was interesting. Like you've identified a lot of gaps and how interesting is happening. What I wanted to understand is, would you like download an APK and then start the review and verification, or like, you would directly scan an app from a page store if you are directly contacted?
Yeah. So so the question in the room was about how you test an Android app. So yeah, you download the APK or you get it from your developer team. You drop it on a rooted device. You fire up a couple of tools to instrument it, and you're off and running. In its simplest sense, try burp and try looking through the manifest and the log files, right? See what you can find. Generally, be able to find something like that out of the gate as a starting point. You take some classes to learn how to use Freighted Radar to do more complex reversing on it. But the how-to guide in there are a couple of tools. One of those links will tell you to get started. Simple tools to get started, a couple of steps. So, large or extra large?
Sure. Right.
All right, now who wants to ask a question? How about in the back first?
Just a quick question. So one of the things, one of the test cases that you mentioned was to check third-party libraries on, on mobile applications.
Mm-hmm.
How far into that do you usually look into? So for example, if a specific application uses a third-party library, do you go ahead and look at the documentation and review the libraries themselves, or is there a
that's good. So the question about how do we deal with third-party libraries? So the answer is it depends. So in other words, if we're doing a pen test for a banking application, we discover it has a vulnerability, we dig through, we find it's a third party. We'll say, okay, we found this vulnerability in this third-party library. Do you want to switch it out? Do you want to go back to them? Do you want us to assist you in going back to them? Right, from that perspective. We won't do a full teardown of the third-party library, we'll just get to the point of knowing it was them.
Okay.
When you reverse on Android through code locations, you get pretty close to kind of where it is. You can certainly know the file or the module where it is. On iOS, you can get at least a file level or module level to know, which gives you the indication whether it's your own code or someone else's code.
Just a follow-up question on one of the points as well. Specifically for the storage section of checking if there's any potential sensitive data is being stored by the application. Based on my experience, which not a lot at all for mobile pen tests, but for example, for jailbroken iPhone device or an Apple device, you get SSH in and then see what kind of things are stored and in the I guess temp folder of that specific application or not. What other things do you want to look for specifically once you're SSH into that jailbroken devices?
Yeah, so you want to look crash logs, you want to look at system logs, because sometimes they will write outside of their own space. One more. System logs, crash logs. Interestingly enough, you could also look at the network logs to see how it's communicating. Some apps use SMS, it's communicating over Wi-Fi. Maybe some other things going on there. While you're in there, you should also just look at how the permissions are set up as well, right? Which is way worse on Android than iOS. I'm going to throw this, but there's food there, so I'm going to hope your neighbors can help you with that. All right, the man in front.
Yeah, what do you think about Electron? Because obviously the way we're talking about mobile application security, the way you want to test it, the way you formally would test it for a single web. obviously like Electron kind of like looks like is in the middle of both of these two things. And it's like basically running a web browser on your phone, right? So would you approach this like the same way, or would you?
Well, so there's a couple different things. It still runs on a device, right? So in the browser frame that it's running in is still running on the device. So you can still look for storage and network. If I go back to where the issues are, storage and network, they have very little to do with the language I wrote the app in and everything to do with how it does I/O. Right, from that perspective. So it may be masking a number of other things. The Electron apps also often will have more server-side than client-side, right? So it can actually help you on the IP side of the house in terms of protecting the IP again. It's written the right way. We're also, people are calling us to come in and pen test things that are made out of out systems and some of these low-code, no-code tools, right? So I think the rate of innovation of sort of development language and frameworks is going to continue growing. I don't think it's stabilizing like it did in Windows or web. So as long as that happens, it's still going to be a challenge. I haven't personally dug in to see how Electron apps are dealing with storage and network individually. I'm just presuming that there's still some of the same things related to those.
Yeah, more or less. I think the other thing too is that, like Electron, like code-based vulnerabilities, like typically the ones that really still exist, and they're made more.
They still exist everywhere.
Yeah.
Here you go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I want to ask, like, is there difference or disadvantage when using a jailbroken, like an old jailbroken device comparing to like the newer version jailbroken device? Like for example, iOS 13 comparing to like iOS 16. Because like usually the newer version iOS will be like really harder to jailbreak.
Yeah, it's a great question about iOS jailbreaking. There is not one for 15 yet, right? So Apple pushes and incents developers to use the latest versions of operating system SDKs. So they're always adding features and trying to entice developers to use them. So you find on iOS versus Android, there's a faster rate of developers creating OS minimum builds. This app requires iOS 13. This app requires iOS 14. They're taking advantage of those APIs. So it's like a carrot and stick behavior. There are a lot of new apps that won't run on older ones. Like I pulled out an old iPad. My wife was going on a trip. She's like, "Can you take one of my iPads?" And it's so old it can't be updated past iOS 12. And there are all these apps where we're downgrading the apps when I tried to download them. Older version of Disney, older version of the New York Times crossword puzzle and stuff like that. You should try. Generally, you should try to use one of the more recent releases of iOS, jailbroken, to do your testing. I would predict there'll be an iOS 15 jailbreak. There are some in the wild; they're just not stable. That will enable that to happen, and the cat and mouse game can go. Right? Google's done some stuff with Android to minimize the tampering, but it's just like there's a whole world around it, so it's not going to go away. Part of that's its architecture. Cool. All right, here you go. I got two more.
Can I set this up like in an emulator rather than in a device?
Can you, yeah, sort of. So, anybody ever heard of a company called Corellium?
Yep.
Famous as one of the few companies to ever win a lawsuit against Apple. So Corellium has created virtualized devices. They have cloud-based and physical hardware that has real chips in it that runs iOS and Android that are jailbroken and rooted if you want. So you can spin up an instance that says, I want iOS 14 jailbroken, I want iOS 15 jailbroken. Now, it doesn't have SMS, doesn't have Wi-Fi, doesn't have Bluetooth, doesn't have accelerometer, so a lot of the sensors are disabled, but the core OS is there. So they take off-the-shelf Apple or iOS or Android operating systems, drop them on their bare metal, and then you can, using a service, log in and do it. You can buy the hardware, like a rack-mounted hardware, or you can subscribe to it on the web. That will give you the closest thing to the real world minus the features that aren't on there because they're not Bluetooth. There are large device farms from Microsoft, from Amazon, from Google, where you can license time. Those are not jailbroken and rooted, but you can use them as basically jail testing oriented environments that they can shoot. So there are emulators that are designed for developers, but they don't really work for pen testing. You're not gonna get very far. So, I mean, you could sniff it with burp to see if there's a network issue. You get no storage. Yeah, you won't be able to test storage.
Question on the workstation toolkit that's developed by non-secure. Are the test cases in that specific tool derived from MSVS as well? Or
Yeah, so think of it as we were doing pen testing before MASVS existed.
Right.
We've continued to help influence the direction of MASVS to go the direction of the things we learned. It's actually interesting. There's things it does in MASVS doesn't do, and there's things in MASVS that we haven't updated it to do. Right? But what it is, you give it is like a booster. So there are a lot of pen testing companies, like the big four large systems integrator, for example. Some of the other boutique pen testing companies, they buy it as a productivity tool, right? So if this thing's just gonna hammer crypto, hammer storage, hammer networking for me, that's like a week's worth of work, and then I'll do the rest manually, right? That's worth it economically. That's the way to think about it, right? It doesn't replace the brains of a smart person, but it gets rid of the wrong work. Right. You already got sure. Yeah.
What's the most useful tool to master for someone who is just starting out on mobile web pen testing?
I think there's a couple things. Basics of understanding how to jailbreak and root a device, learn how the operating systems are built and the apps live in the operating systems. That's kind of knowledge. Tool-wise, because networking is the highest vulnerability area, burp, Zen attack, any of those, learn how to do basic network testing because you're going to find stuff left and right. So again, remember, the developer has to set up their own network connection and secure communication, so they're more likely to screw it up, unless they use APS. So a different way to put it is, the fastest way to know if it's likely your app is secure over the network is to look and see if your developers are using ATS or NSC on Android. It's more likely your network communications are safe as long as everything is using that channel, right, from that perspective. So that's like take hundreds of lines of code and smash them into, did you make one API call? Is that helpful? The other thing would be dumpster diving the log files, looking for forensic data, which you could just do by remote accessing the device. That'd be a fancy tool. And you get one. All right, time for one. Is there anybody remote? You take those remote?
Yeah, I
just
just asked Ophi, nobody with questions yet.
So I didn't bore him to death. I got one more left.
another question if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
A lot of questions. So going back to the third-party library checking, you said that it really depends on the client and the type of application and information that they're storing and using.
The question you asked me, the way I interpreted it was, how deep do we go in the third-party library?
Yes.
Because if we're hired by company X,
Right.
using a library, we just have to prove it's not their code.
I see. And do you typically on an engagement, do you typically take that into consideration for the scoping timeline? Like if they say, oh, we might be using this and this, and the way you scope the engagement.
So we take a mostly black box approach
I see.
when we pen test. So we will ask basic questions about do you have a threat model? Can you give us your threat model? We've tested in every kind of industry. We tested TVs, smart TVs running Tizen with apps on it and stuff like that. So most industries we have our own model that we use, but we'll see what they care about. And then we'll ask the sensitive data questions, right? So we've got a sensitive data questionnaire and we have an IP questionnaire. And those help the pen testers be smarter about where they hunt, right? So common thing would be British Airways, give us a ticket string that's a test string that pattern matches the common ticket that we can use to generate an airline ticket and see if that data is leaked anywhere, right? So there'd be some things like that. We need creds and then any other unique either tokens or unique data that's representative often of a product, a thing, something like that, right, that we can search for. Because that stuff you find spewed all over the place. All right, I gave you the last shirt because you were first here. It's right there. So thanks everybody for having me. Appreciate the time. You will get a copy of the slides, and I'm happy to direct you to other people in the organization. I'm serious about looking for pen testing people, so if you're interested, you can sign up or just come learn more and then sign up. Okay, thank you. All right, yeah, thank you everybody for coming out. Yeah, huge thanks to our sponsors, and thank you so much, Okta. This has been so great, all of your hosting and everything. What did you have? Yeah.
Just a little hi, everybody. Okta is here to help you all, and especially because you mentioned authentication and authorization. So if you want to learn more, there is a developer center that us at Auth0, which are part of Okta now, we do, which is developers.auth0.com. There is a bunch of information on Auth0, authentication, authorization. There is a lot of developer productivity tools, and you can even get in touch with the developer relations team, which I'm part of. So thank you so much for coming.
We like Auth0, we use Auth0.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Sophie, as well, for the
Yeah,
online
thanks for the
support.
words. We'll be around for a few minutes, so feel free to talk to either Ryan or myself. And there's OWASP cards there if you want to learn about the spec a little bit more. And there's some really funny stickers that say false positives suck. Which, if you're a tester, you know what that means.
Exactly. Down for the bar, down to grab a drink, or
If you guys want to.
yeah, we could go grab a drink after if you guys are around.
I'm gonna go ahead and log out of all this tech.
Yeah.
I think we're streaming like 5 ways from Sunday.
No. We got it. We figured it out.
It's good, it worked.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
One streaming layer on top of another streaming layer.
Oh, yeah. Also